The map was never meant to exist, not because it was lost, not because it was destroyed, but because if it were accepted as real, it would force historians to rewrite the story of discovery itself. For more than 500 years, students have learned a simple narrative. In 1492, Europeans crossed the Atlantic and found a new world. The age of exploration began, civilizations met for the first time, and history changed direction. But what if the meeting had already happened? What if ships bearing foreign banners reached the Americas nearly a century earlier, and then deliberately erased the evidence? Tonight we examine the mystery of the Vinland Ledger, a set of records, maps, and royal accounts that suggest transatlantic contact decades before Columbus ever sailed. And the deeper question, not whether exploration happened earlier, but why someone wanted it forgotten. In 1473, the port of Bristol was one of the busiest in Europe. Merchants traded wool, tin, salt fish, and timber across the North Atlantic routes. Officially, they sailed to Iceland, occasionally to Greenland, nowhere beyond. But port tax records show something unusual. Several ships departed under license for a destination listed only as the Western Land. No coordinates, no kingdom, no known colony. Yet the cargo was unmistakable. Iron tools, timber saws, agricultural seed grain, and priests. You do not send priests to trade. You send them to settle. For decades, historians dismissed the entries as clerical shorthand for Icelandic voyages. Then, in 1890, a sealed merchant ledger was discovered during renovations beneath a Bristol counting house. Inside were payment notes referencing the land past Greenland, and more curiously, the phrase Terra Vini, the land of vines. The Latin translation, Vinland, a name already known from Norse sagas written centuries earlier describing a fertile land across the ocean, where grapes grew wild and winters were mild. Until that moment, those sagas were considered legend, poetic exaggeration, mythology of adventurous sailors. But the ledger was not poetry. It was accounting. And accountants rarely record fantasies when taxes are involved. If medieval merchants believed land existed across the Atlantic, the implications were enormous. It would mean knowledge revived from Viking exploration centuries earlier and quietly circulated through trade networks long before official discovery narratives began. But something stranger appears in the ledger's final pages. A notation written in a different hand, possibly years later. Orders from the Crown. No further western venture without royal charter. Existing records to be sealed. No explanation. No justification. Only instruction. Within 3 years, all western sailing stopped. Not gradually. Immediately, ports that quietly funded expeditions suddenly treated them as prohibited ventures. Maps referencing western lands vanished from navigation schools, and references to Vinland disappeared from English maritime records entirely. Then, 2 decades later, Columbus sailed under Spanish authority, claiming discovery of lands never before known to Europe. Never before known, officially. Why would a monarchy suppress evidence of new territory? At the time, Europe operated on competing claims sanctioned by the Church. Discovery was not merely exploration. It granted legal ownership through papal authority. Whoever announced land first gained moral and economic control. If England already possessed knowledge of Western territories but lacked political leverage to claim them, revealing the discovery prematurely could invite stronger empires to seize them instead. Silence could be strategy. Delay could be advantage. But delay became disappearance. Because another document surfaces in 1527, a diplomatic letter from a Spanish ambassador complaining about English fishermen trespassing in northern western waters they pretend not to know. Pretend not to know. The phrase suggests performance, not ignorance. Centuries passed before archaeology complicated the story further. In 1960, remains of a Norse settlement were discovered in Newfoundland, Canada. Timber structures, iron nails, and weaving tools dated to around the year 1000. Proof Vikings reached North America nearly 500 years before Columbus. But the settlement was small, temporary. A failed colony rather than lasting contact. It answered whether the crossing was possible. It did not explain why later Europeans might have hidden knowledge of it. Then cartographers noticed something else. A 15th century European map, drawn before Columbus, depicted a landmass west of Greenland shaped uncannily like North America's eastern coastline. Scholars debated whether it was coincidence, imagination, or copied Norse information preserved through oral networks among sailors. But one marginal note changed the argument. From Bristol sailors, year of our Lord 1480. If true, it meant sailors were not rediscovering America in the 1490s. They were returning to somewhere they already knew existed. So why erase it? Because discovery is power, but timing is control. During the late 15th century, Europe balanced on fragile alliances. Spain and Portugal negotiated the Treaty of Tordesillas, dividing unknown lands between them along a papal meridian. England was politically weaker, recovering from internal conflict. Announcing discovery without ability to defend claim might lose the land permanently. Better to wait. But history rarely follows planned schedules. Spain moved first. Portugal secured routes around Africa. And by the time England was ready, the official story had already been written. So the earlier knowledge remained inconvenient. In the 18th century, a historian compiling Royal Maritime Archives wrote privately that several early navigation logs were absent by instruction rather than decay. He never published a remark. It survived only in a marginal personal notebook discovered 200 years later. Historians debated its meaning. Was it routine archiving or deliberate removal? Because absence in archives can occur naturally. But consistent absence across multiple repositories suggests coordination. The deeper mystery is psychological rather than geographical. Civilizations build identity around beginnings. Founding moments define legitimacy. The age of discovery anchors modern global history. Trade networks, colonization, cultural exchange, and conflict all trace back to that narrative starting point. Change the beginning, and the moral narrative shifts. Instead of sudden encounter, history becomes prolonged awareness. Instead of brave accident, it becomes strategic secrecy. Instead of discovery, recognition. And recognition implies responsibility earlier than acknowledged. Modern researchers examining shipping insurance records found premiums issued for voyages categorized as long western fisheries decades before official exploration rights were granted. Investors rarely insure impossible journeys. They insure expected routes. Even more curious, some early North American indigenous oral traditions describe sporadic visits from pale-skinned traders before sustained European colonization. Not conquest, not settlement, brief exchanges. These accounts were long dismissed because they did not match written European timelines. But if the timeline itself shifted, those stories no longer contradict history. They complement it. So what happened to the Vinland ledger after its discovery in the 19th century? It was cataloged, studied briefly, then transferred to private archival custody for preservation. Public references to it dwindled, not banned, not denied, simply not emphasized. The most effective way to hide information is rarely destruction. It is classification as unimportant. Today, most historians agree Vikings reached North America centuries before Columbus. That once controversial claim became accepted after physical evidence emerged. But the second question, whether later Europeans quietly maintained knowledge of those lands, remains unresolved not because evidence is impossible, but because it exists scattered across disciplines. Trade logs, diplomatic complaints, cartography, insurance papers, and oral histories. Individually inconclusive, collectively suggestive. History often rejects conclusions without a single dramatic proof. It prefers one decisive artifact rather than a pattern of smaller confirmations. Yet real human activity rarely leaves cinematic evidence. It leaves bureaucracy, and bureaucracy whispers rather than shouts. So did Europe discover America once? Or remember it twice? The answer may never be declared official because official history requires consensus, and consensus requires simplicity. But the records remain: ships taxed for Western voyages, maps drawn before explorers sailed, diplomats complaining about knowledge others denied possessing, and a ledger quietly sealed with royal instruction. Perhaps the greatest historical mysteries are not secrets someone perfectly hid. They are truths hidden in plain sight, dismissed because accepting them would make the past less tidy than the stories we teach. The ocean did not change in 1492. Only the narrative did. And somewhere between legend and paperwork lies a possibility that the world was connected long before anyone officially announced it.